Welcome to Developing Graphics Frameworks with Python and OpenGL, Part 40, Rendering Scenes with Textures. In the last three videos, we've added most of the basic texture-related functionality we need in this graphics framework. We have a texture class, which is able to store texture data. We have added UV coordinates to our geometric objects, and we now have a texture-based material which will make use of that texture object and the UV coordinates, and now we just need to put it all together and render a scene. So for our first scene, we're going to render a rectangle. It's not very exciting, but we also haven't had a chance to really check or test or debug our code up to this point. So we'll start off by seeing if we can render just a basic image on a rectangle. You can use any image file which you have, which you can access conveniently. There's nothing special about this particular image. But I'll try to render this onto a triangle. So to begin, let's go to our graphics development framework. Let's go to test template first of all. So there's a bunch of classes we're going to use a lot. So I'd actually like to start by adding some code to our test template, and then we'll make a copy of this and render our texture-based scene. So in the template file, let's go ahead and start by adding from core.texture import texture. Also, for geometries, let's also add in from geometry.rectangle geometry. We'll import the rectangle geometry class. And spheres turn out to be really fun too. So let's say from geometry.sphere geometry, we'll import the sphere geometry class. In addition to these materials, let's add in the texture material we created in the last video as well. So from material.textureMaterial, we'll import the class TextureMaterial. All right, that's a good set of import statements which should get us through a lot of projects. Now we'll create our test file in our root directory. Let's make a new file. Since this is video 40, I'm going to save this one as test-40.py. And as usual, in the test template file, I'll start by copying all of that code and pasting it into this test class. Now a few changes I'd like to make. Let's see. If we were to just render this one right away, and if we build this file, we've already caught our first error. Let's see. In the texture.py file, I need to add a colon at the end of that. So let me open up the texture. That's in core. Right, at the end of this line, we do need a colon. Let's save that. Let's see if we can run our basic example now. Inconsistent use of tabs and spaces and indentation. I hate it when that happens. So let's go over again to the texture class. Right? And in Sublime Text, one thing we can do is if we actually highlight things, we can see in some places there's spaces, and in some places there's tabs which were used. It's indicated by the dashes or the dots. I like to use spaces myself. So what I'd like to do is in the View menu, Indentation, we'll convert indentation to spaces. So now it's consistent. Let's save that. Let's try running our test again. It takes a while before we can get to that very first thing. All right, hey, there's our box. It's not textured, but that's okay. All right, what I'd like to do now is within our test class, I can close the template, I'll close texture. And let's replace box geometry with rectangle geometry. Let's create a texture. I'll call it text. This is a texture object. In my project directory, I actually have an images folder where I've put all sorts of different images. I'll use one called grid.png. And then for the material, instead of using a surface basic material, let's use a texture material. I don't need that property, but it does expect a texture to be passed in as a parameter. All right, the moment of truth. Let's save this and then let's build. Will we see an image? Oh, nope. So what's the error here? P0 is not defined. Huh, in rectangle geometry? Is it possible we introduced an error? Let's take a look. Ha! Why is that P? Oh, that should be P0. That was strange. All right, let's go back to our test class. Let's build that one more time. All right, Pygame image. I thought I had something with that name in the directory. Oh, you know what? Since this is the first time, I actually haven't created an images folder yet. So I should go ahead and do that. All right, and through the magic of video editing, I've now updated my structure a little bit. Within my Python graphics folder, I have now added an images folder. And within that image, I've added a few basic textures, including the grid image that we've seen a few times before. It's one of the things I love about Sublime Text. It has a built-in image viewer. It does it all. All right, now this exists. And so if I try running test 40 again, maybe now we'll see a grid. Not quite yet. We're getting closer though. If self.settings wireframe. Oh, dictionary object is not callable. I used parentheses instead of brackets. Let's go to material, texture material. Did I do that? I did do that. All right. Let's change those to brackets. I used brackets down here. All right, save that change and test 40. Let's try building that one more time. There we have it. We have our little rectangle. All right, this is very exciting. It's so exciting, I actually want to add a rig so I can move around and observe that up close. I could just change the position of the camera, but it'd be much more fun to add a rig. So from extras.movementRig, let's import movement rig. And then in our test class, let's also do self.rig equals a movement rig. Then self.rig.add self.camera. I no longer need to set the camera position. Instead, I'll set the rig position. So self.rig.setPosition. I'll put that at 003. And I will comment out that line. I no longer need it. Now that we've added a rig, remember I also want to update the rig. I do that in the update function. Self.rig.update. I need to give it access to the input object until it a 60th of a second has gone by. Now let's run this again. Should see the same scene as before, but now I can use the arrow keys to move around. In particular, I can kind of look at this from an angle. And we have backface rendering on by default, so I see that if I go around to the backside, I can see this as well. I mean, it kind of looks like I'm just spinning the texture. That's because we really don't have any sense of scale. But fortunately, we have a class for that. From extras.gridHelper, import grid helper. Right, so just so we can kind of more easily visualize how we're moving around that scene, in the initialize class, let's say self.scene.add a grid helper. Let's rebuild and let's take a look. All right. So that grid is not really aligned with the floor, so I should also rotate the grid helper as well. So let me say grid equals grid helper. I need to name the object and assign it to a variable so I can call its methods. Grid.rotatex, pi over 2, that's 90 degrees. All right, now we have a grid that should be aligned with the floor. Yep, and sure enough, the reason I see a white line here is because my rig is also level with the floor. If I fly up a bit, I can now move around and see this texture from all sides. Very fun. All right, and just so I don't have to fly up right away, I'll elevate my rig by changing the y coordinate of the position to 1. That's a pretty fun scene, but we could make it a lot more fun. It's exciting to use textures, and it opens up a whole world of possibilities. So one thing that I'd like to show you, moving beyond the test scene, is using something called a spherical texture. So in this case, spherical texture is just a texture that looks correct when applied to a sphere. So here on the left we have a texture, a map of the Earth, but when you take the surface of the Earth and try to distort it into a rectangular texture, you actually get a lot of distortion around the North Pole and the South Pole. But if you were to apply this to a sphere, it would look absolutely fine. And so let's go ahead and try out a spherical texture. Heading back to Sublime, I have an image of the Earth right there. So what I'd like to do is apply this image to a sphere and put that in our world as well. Put a world in our world. So we have our geometry mesh. For now, I'm going to go ahead and comment that out. Instead, I'm going to create I'll call this sphere geometry equals sphere geometry. And then I'll call this maybe an earth texture. This will be a texture from the images directory, earth.jpg. And I'll call this earth material. That will be a texture material which uses the earth texture. Now I'll create a mesh from this geometry and material. And I'll call that mesh, well, I want to name meshes well, so I'll call that earth. In fact, just so I can reference it in the update function later, let's check my spelling of earth. I'll call this self.earth is equal to a mesh built from this sphere geometry and also from the earth material. Now self.scene.add self.earth. And I just realized I commented out not exactly the right code up here. I don't want to add the rectangular mesh to the scene, but I do want to add this earth. And I'll also move it up a little bit above the grid. So self.earth.setPosition, let's set that to 0, 1, 0. Let's go ahead and build this project. And sure enough, we now have a world in our scene. And if you wish, you could also, say, make the Earth rotate on its axis. Let's do that in the update function. After updating our rig, let's say self.earth rotate around its y-axis. This amount is in radians. Let's go ahead and build, and we should see an image of a rotating Earth. Very cool. Our interactive scenes are rapidly becoming very exciting. All right, the next thing I'd like to show you how to do to make a slightly more interesting scene. Let's see, I want to go back to that slideshow. Now, we've seen how to apply a spherical texture to make something that looks like a planet, but spherical textures can be used in other ways too. So here, I've got a spherical texture that I can use to simulate an environment. Now, what I mean by that is this image, right, it includes a sun and some clouds and some earth, and this is, you might notice, distorted in the same way that the map of the Earth is also distorted. I'm going to take this texture and apply it to a sphere, but I would like to make that sphere very, very large. Right? The sphere is going to simulate our entire environment. So let me go ahead and go back to Sublime. And I have an image. That image I just showed you in my images directory. And let's go back to test 40. All right, what I'd like to do now is add another sphere geometry, but this sphere geometry is going to be a lot larger. And I need to give it a new name. Let me call this one sky geometry. So this is a sphere geometry, and let's set the radius equal to, I don't know, 200. And let's say sky material. Right? One way you can create a material, you don't actually have to save the texture to a separate variable. If you're only going to use it once, you could declare it within a parameter. So TextureMaterial built with a texture from the images directory. Call this one sky_earth.jpg. Is it JPEG? It is. All right, so creating that material, and then we'll say the sky is a mesh made from the sky geometry and the sky material. And then let's just add that to our scene. Self.scene.add sky. So we'll effectively be sitting inside this enormous sphere, and it should simulate the effect of Earth and clouds. Right, and in the grid helper, to make a little bit of contrast here, I might want to change the color of the grid. And so I might say grid color equals black in this case. I think that's the way grid helper works. Right, we can set the grid color, and we can also set the color of the center line as well. All right, so we're adding an environmental image. Let's go ahead and build this one more time. I don't see anything. Something is amiss. See, we have a texture applied to a geometry. We make that into the sky. See, I think we're rendering the back faces. See, if we don't add this to the sky, it should be fine. Sure. Now, why can't we see this? Let's see, it's a radius 200. We know that sphere geometry works. Let's take a look at the camera class. I think I know what the problem is. And the core camera class, yep. So one thing we have to be careful of is when we're using cameras, this is how far the camera can see. The camera can only see things up to a distance of 100 world units away. By giving this a radius of 200 world units, it was beyond the camera bounds. So To avoid that mistake again, maybe I'll just increase the far default distance in the camera class. So in core directory camera.py, I'm changing far to 1000. I really don't want to make the sky too much smaller, because then that would ruin the immersive effect of it. All right, let's try this again. Oh, and I had commented out adding the sky, so I'll need to stop this and bring that back in, rebuild. Hey, and now we have our spinning Earth, but if we look around us, it's as if we're in this large virtual environment. Right? We can actually look up. Right? We see the sun up there. Notice that the texture doesn't look distorted now because it's applied to a sphere. And because the world is so large, right, if I start moving, right, if I move to the left or to the right, you can see that I'm moving based on the grid helper down here. You might notice the things out near the horizon, they don't appear to be moving. In truth, they are. If you look really closely at the clouds, you can see them moving slightly. But because of parallax, you would expect objects in the far distance, to move more slowly relative to objects close to you. That was fun. I accidentally went inside the Earth. Everything looks weird in here. All right. So hey, we've got a lot of really cool materials to work with. So now we can create exciting, more immersive, textured, three-dimensional scenes. Very fun. Thanks for watching.